Being a Harry Potter fan myself, it was a great privilege and pleasure to dive into this book and just like dive into everything Keshava has written. I'll ask him to talk to you a little bit about the book.
So I just wanted to start by telling the story behind the book, the backstory, how the book came to be. And it goes back to a Saturday about 20 years ago. It was the summer of 1999, and I just started the fourth standard. And I knew even then that it was going to be a very important day in my life because I just represented our school in a quiz, and although we came second, I got a book token prize. So this was going to be the first day where I could buy a book with my own money, choose a book and pay for it myself. And I knew exactly what book I wanted. So off we went to Premier Bookshop, late and much lamented, and and there it was, this paperback about the size of my head, this published by HarperCollins, I should say, this magnificent green, the color of mud right after the monsoon, with a wizard with a long white beard on the cover, The Lord of the Rings, right? And I was enraptured by the sight of this thing. It was, if you think of the Javed Akhtar song and you change the first line to "Ek kitab ko dekha to aisa laga," that was my state of mind, right?
No, wait, we are talking about Harry Potter
The
or
Lord of
Lord
the
of the
Rings, the Lord of
Rings?
the Rings, the Lord of the Rings.
Oh
Yeah,
my
yeah, yeah.
God, okay.
No, never. Dumbledore was never on the cover of Harry Potter that I know of. Okay, so and I went home. I don't think I've ever been happier. Now later that day, my father went to the place that my sister and I used to call his office, Koshi's Parade Cafe, which, unlike Premier, is very much still in business. And at Parades, he met a boy called Abhimanyu. Now, Abhimanyu, who I think or hope is here today, is the son of a very old friend of my mother's. And Abhi had just moved back from the UK and was going to join my class. This was also very important because, books aside, I didn't have any friends. And I thought, well, he's new, he won't know anyone, maybe we can be friends. And Abhi asked my father, well, what is Keshava reading? And my father told him about The Lord of the Rings. And Abhi said, and now it's my father quoting Abhi, well, I don't know that. The only books worth reading these days are the Henry Potter books. I mean, so you couldn't imagine a more bookish child than me at that age. Summer of 1999, I hadn't even heard of these things, right? So Abhi joins school, tells me the real name of these books, and within a week or 2 weeks back, we are at Premiere, not with my own money, but we have the first two books. I read them probably that weekend. And now part of the rest of the story you all know. So by the end of 1999, every child in my class who read books had read these books, which meant I finally had something to talk to people about. By the summer of 2000, Goblet of Fire became maybe the first book in human history to be released simultaneously at midnight on 6 continents with queues of people outside bookshops and Walmarts and what have you. And then something else important happened in my life, which is that I discovered the internet. So I think most people who knew me as a child would know that I hated being a child. Evelyn Waugh used to say that children were defective adults, and I really knew that feeling. I was desperate to be a grown up. I couldn't wait. When my parents had friends over, I would be eavesdropping on the conversation. I wanted childhood to end immediately. And with the internet, uh, especially the sort of anarchic internet as it was then, I discovered adult Harry Potter fan communities. It didn't seem to me strange to me that adults read Harry Potter, but the fact that they did meant that I could, in a way, be in the company of adults. Under a pseudonym, nobody would know that I was 10 years old or whatever. And as some of you will know, what were these communities? Well, they wrote fan fiction, that is, stories inspired by the books. They created fan art. There were endless discussions, above all on the theme of whether Ron and Hermione or Harry and Hermione would
Yeah,
make
the
the better
shippers.
couple. A topic on which I still have strong feelings. And but for me, so I've always had a fanatical curiosity about other people, right? It's why I'm a notorious gossip. It's why I love reading and writing fiction. And through these communities, I was curious about these people, not just through Harry Potter, but about them as people. And what I noticed was, well, they come from every background, every cultural background, every class background. They're of all ages. And also, I saw that they mattered to each other. These people had relationships with each other that were of deep emotional importance. Uh, anyway, all things move on, right? So the world moved on. 9/11 happened, the Iraq War happened, the financial crisis happened. The English speaking world, at any rate, entered into a funk, a sort of sense of foreboding that seems to only get worse with every passing year. The reason I mention this is because Harry Potter comes from a more optimistic time. It also comes from it's a time when we didn't check the news, every few seconds. But it also comes from a time when the internet was community led, and also when Twitter and Instagram hadn't air fried our attention spans. All of these things enabled in a way the Harry Potter fan. So the word moved on. Uh, Harry Potter fandom as a community slowly dissolved after the rise of social media. And I moved on. I moved on to what I thought of as grown-up books like Philip Roth or J.M. Coetzee. Then years later, I was a student in the US, and I was thinking about questions like loneliness and relationships across cultures. And at the same time, three of the characters who appear in this book had appeared to me individually: the Kannan, Curtis, and Rebecca. And then one day I was talking on GChat to a friend of mine, and I said, I'd love to write a romance set in Boston about an intercultural romance. And then, sort of providentially, I remembered Harry Potter fandom. So, E.M. Forster, I think, described a passage to India as a little bridge of sympathy between East and West. Now, this isn't a book about Harry Potter. It's not even really a book about Harry Potter fandom. It's a book about four people. As I said earlier, an interest in other people is why I like to write fiction. But Harry Potter fandom is a bridge, right? It's the bridge across cultures. It's a bridge across generations between Kannan and Grimmett, or between Rebecca and Grimmett. It was the bridge that allowed these four very different people's lives to intersect, and therefore allowed me to write this book and us to be here.
Um, Thank you so much, Keshava. That's an excellent summary of your relationship with this book, which has brought us here today. So, I really want to know, how deep into the fandoms did you go, and did you write any fanfic yourself? And are you a Harry Hermione shipper? I hate you.
Well, these days we know that J.K. Rowling is also a Harry Hermione shipper. She's like
Yeah, she's too revisionist. I mean,
yeah.
really.
So anyway, so you get there in the end, just like she did. But so I so I was mostly what they called a lurker, right? So I read these posts. I also I didn't really want to be given away as being how old I was, and I thought that you can only pretend to be a grown up so well. Uh, and I was more interested in what they had to say than what I might have to say, to be honest. I wrote a couple of pieces of fan fiction that survive publicly on the internet under a pseudonym. If anyone wants to find out, it's a character from Madame Bovary. If you want to guess what the pseudonym is.
Wow, you were a
No. I
precocious
wrote
child.
those were written a few years later, I should say. But yeah, no, I never got to know anybody through Harry Potter fandom. But I could tell that there were serious friendships, and I'm sure there must be marriages, although I don't know specifically of any there that must have come about through Harry Potter.
Right, right. So actually, yeah, I mean, when you talk about this fandom in your book, and of course, like Keshava said, I mean, the book is only set in that fandom. I mean, these people could be anywhere doing anything, but it's just that this is one thing that they are all passionate about, which kind of brings them together. But I mean, people think fandoms are very niche, these cultish things. So not many people understand that these are actually huge subcultures. And in one part in the book, you do mention that the size of the Harry Potter fandom itself. I mean, because the readership is so wide, the fandoms are the size of, like, more people are writing Harry Potter fan fiction than people are reading Don DeLillo,
Yeah.
an American great.
Yeah. So the example given in the book was this one particular fan fiction writer, of whom Curtis Grimmett says, "I bet more people read her than read Don
Athena,
Don
yeah.
DeLillo." Exactly. Yeah.
Right. So any other, I mean, how big is this fandom, and why did it die? And do you feel sad that it's over now?
No, I think, as I said, I think there were lots of things so okay. The other thing I didn't mention in my opening remarks were there's something that in Harry Potter fandom was known as, I don't think anyone calls it this anymore, but as the 3 year summer. So in 2000, after Goblet of Fire came out, J.K. Rowling was burnt out after 4 books in 4 years, and she took 3 years to write the next book. And so there was a lot of space for fandom to fill.
Right. And So, why do you think Harry Potter is this cultural artifact which inspired this kind of
Oh, yeah.
fandom? I mean, I was telling you about Philip Pullman, right? Whose books are equally amazing, I mean, equally inventive and engaging, but not that kind of
So,
fandom.
look, the person who knew why Harry Potter became Harry Potter would be the greatest publisher of all time. I mean, but because the Harry Potter, J.K. Rowling is the only writer in human history to be truly universal in her own lifetime. Because Shakespeare took centuries to become a universal writer. She became a universal writer as she was writing, right, across all languages, continents, everything. So I have two theories, and you can decide for yourself how quarter, half, or three-fourths baked they are. So one is that Harry Potter, everyone thinks of it as a fantasy novel. I think of it as the realist stowaway on the fantasy ship, right? So a lot of what draws people to Harry Potter are the quotidian details and also, crucially, so compared to Philip Pullman or Lord of the Rings, uh, I think the way that children waited for their Hogwarts letter, there was a way in which, because it was our world with a little kink rather than a totally different world. The other thing is that this is Kannan's theory in the book actually, which is that it's the nature of the universe that she created. So you could you think of her as what Aristotle would call a prime mover, a sort of originator. But then there's so much room to expand the universe in all directions, and that actually might be just a fluke in a way. I don't think she planned it that way, but that certainly seems to be a defining quality of the books.
I'm very curious about this. Did you have to like get permission from her agents or whatever to do this?
So I would have had to had I included actual fan fiction in the book. And there's one paragraph of fan fiction in the book, and that deliberately is only one paragraph long and includes no Harry Potter characters. And it's set in Madras, and that's the reason why. Because otherwise, yes, I would have needed to.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, Keshava, I mean, throughout the book, there are. It's not just Harry Potter. You seem to have been steeped in pop culture, and I'm just wondering, like, growing up in a very serious household like yours, father a historian, mother a designer. So, I mean, how did you sort of get so immersed into pop culture? Was it ever frowned upon? What are the other like? Did you sort of rebel against seriousness?
So, well, firstly, thank you, Shrabonti, for being the first person to interview me this weekend who acknowledges that I have two parents. But it's a good it's a good question. It's a good question. So apart from the fact from okay, so let me just a little bit more generally talk about the relationship between family and this book. So, because I think there are two really important things. One is, look, I grew up in a home that was full of books, right? And my parents both, in very different ways, love reading all their lives. Children will emulate their parents, and I see this with my friends today who have small children, and they have to avoid using their smartphones because they know that that's how they stop their children thinking that, well, smartphones are
Most
cool.
parents fail.
Yeah, well, I thought books were cool, right? But the other thing is, my parents, whether because they were so, serious about their own careers, they didn't have the time for this, but I think more because it was actually their temperament. Just we were free to, my sister and I were really free to read or watch whatever we wanted. This was especially useful in, so I probably watched, I mean, there's a pulp fiction reference in the first chapter. I probably watched that when I was like 12 or 13, right? So, but uh, this is really important because Harry Potter fandom included, Harry Potter fan fiction was rated, G, PG, PG-13, R, like movies, right? And pretty much all the fan fiction I liked was R rated, not because it was like so full of sexual content, but because it was written by grown-ups for grown-ups, right? Like it was like any other grown-up book. And I really don't think, well, I don't think my parents knew, but I do not think they would have been bothered. So it was more that I had that freedom.
Right. So, actually talking about pop culture, and so recently the BBC came up with this list of the 100 best books, which I mean, books that change lives. And for probably the first time ever, a serious literary list had a number of genre books. And there's always been this divide between literary fiction and genre fiction, and you have in some way actually bridged that because you're writing literary fiction about genre fiction. But this whole divide, where do you think that it's kind of melting now, and people are starting to take genre seriously?
So this is a really important question with resonance far beyond this book, right? So I also now, as of the last few months, have a day job in publishing, and so I sort of have a couple of different views on this. But I think that we as an industry of writers, especially publishers, have I'm not overstating this. We have committed a serious crime in the way we talk about books, and particularly the way we talk about novels. You know, whoever if any publisher should have been sent to the gulag, it's the one who came up with the phrase literary fiction. Seriously, like books are meant to be enjoyed. They're meant to give us joy. They make life more worth living. And of course, there are books that aspire to the status of art, and there are books that don't. And that's for every reader to decide. But you know, we can't talk about books like some books are good for you, and some books are not. Like books are not books. Even the most serious, any book worth reading, you shouldn't read it because it's like taking your multivitamins or eating broccoli. You should eat it like it's drinking a nice glass of wine, right? It's that's what books are for, and we shouldn't really. Of course, we should evaluate books seriously. We should judge books. We should acclaim good books, but we should. I think it's very healthy if we're starting to talk about books that were once called genre fiction as great books.
Right. Do you think this book is only for Harry Potter fans? You answered a little bit of that in your introduction, but
So there's one of Arvind Adiga was very sort of give a very generous endorsement of this book, and the thing that meant the most to me was that Arvind himself has never read Harry Potter, right? I would say to that is that people, every reader, what every reader takes out of a book is what every reader brings to it, right? So certainly people who have read Harry Potter will appreciate the book on a certain level, but also people who have lived in Boston will, right? Or people who have lived in
right,
Madras. But the other thing is that, so obviously books give us different kinds of pleasures, and there's the pleasure of familiarity or recognition. There's also the pleasure of unfamiliarity. Personally, as a reader, I'm more drawn to unfamiliarity. The last thing I would ever want to do is read a book and think, oh my God, this person is just like me, right? Or I know this so well. No, I don't. I want to say, no, that's what it's like over there. So,
yeah,
I
books
would
are
hope,
also so much about discovery.
yeah. So I would hope that someone who hasn't read Harry Potter might think, well, that was, you seem like some really
It
crazy people,
inspired so much.
or whatever. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. How much of yourself did you put into your characters? And Kannan, for instance, who grows up in Bangalore and then goes to Boston. And I mean, obviously, you didn't have a father who came back from a bank and started reading a newspaper, hid behind his newspaper, rather. But, like, did you see anything of yourself
So
in him?
Kannan is a particular. Let me very briefly state. Kannan is he's born in the 1970s. So in the action in the book, he's in his 20s. He's an engineer. Goes to the US to do his masters. Stays on. Kannan was almost. He's a funny case. He's demographically the most like me in that he comes from Bangalore. We are sort of from a similar caste. But he's almost. But in every other way, he's the most unlike me. Right. So I grew up imbibing books. Harry Potter was the first book he ever read. I grew up in a very, very loving and happy family. Kannan's family is defined by the absence of love. If you want to say what makes his family, Tolstoy's line of all unhappy families being unhappy in their own way, Kannan's family is unhappy from the fact that love has never crossed the threshold of their apartment.
Right. And who's your favorite character among all of them? Is
Yes.
it Kannan again?
It's sort of like, depends on the day you ask me, right? I think that often when I was writing the book, so there's a character in the book who Kannan has a deep friendship with, or an intense friendship, I should say, called Curtis Grimmett, who is in his early 50s and is a radio, he hosts a public radio show in Boston. I think when I was writing the book, he was someone I enjoyed writing those scenes a lot. I identified with him in some ways, obviously not in others. Kannan is the closest the book has to a protagonist. He's
Right.
also the character who's grown the most through successive revisions. I think I've come to understand him a bit better over time.
I don't know how much time we have left. As an editor now, somebody who sort of edits books, commissions books, I mean, what are the kind of books that appeal to you? I mean, would you think you'll ever find a Harry Potter? I mean, find a J.K. Rowling yourself?
Well,
And how does
obviously, one lives in hope. Let me say what I'm hoping to find when I think look, at Juggernaut, where I work in Delhi, we most, at least with fiction, we only publish Indian writers, right? So we don't do any international or imported fiction. And I would say I'm looking for two things. The first is fiction that seriously engages with India today and with how it's changed. It's a crazy fact about Indian writers in English that, with very few exceptions, they have spent most of their adult lives abroad, certainly after finding success. I mean, Arundhati Roy and Arvind Adiga are the two notable exceptions. And it's precisely why Arundhati Roy and Arvind Adiga are the two who have continued to engage with the changes in India, right? In a way that, I won't name names, but people who have been decades out, I think, have the good sense to know that they can't, right? So that's the first thing I'm looking for. A book like Ghachar Ghochar by Vivek Shanbhag or Arvind's own Last Man in Tower, I think, exemplify what I'm looking for. The other thing I would say is, let me tell you what I find in submissions that I wish were different. I think that, and this maybe comes from the difference between literary fiction and genre, the people have in their minds between literary fiction and genre fiction. I wish that young writers would write in a tone, in what I guess they call a voice that is natural to them, would know that the language in which they think can also be the language of the page, and and that you can look what we're still waiting for the Mark Twain who can know that Huckleberry Finn's voice can be the highest art, right? So I see people come in and they're trying to sound like Anthony Trollope or whatever they've been taught in BA English, and they have to try to sound like themselves.
Yeah, I must say that your language itself is beautiful, and like I told you earlier, I mean, the construction of sentences, it's almost Austen-esque at times, and I could feel that you like good writing and you enjoy elegant construction of language, but that is entirely natural to you. So is that why you chose to write like that?
Yeah, so I think the words are certainly natural to me. But the thing I've tried to do in this book is, because there are four different, what we call, viewpoint characters. So you see the world through, although it's written in the third person, you're in their heads. The language shifts a little bit depending on whose point of view it is. So because Grimmett and Rebecca are American, because they're sort of have had elite Western educations, that's also reflected in the nature of, and because they're very well read. Malti is much more well read than Kannan. I think his language can sometimes have a sparer, slightly colder quality to it. At least that's the way I intended it. But yes, no, I mean, the great thing about the third person and the why, it's the most liberating form of writing, because you only truly have to sound like yourself.
Yeah.
You're not actually impersonating fully anybody else.
Yeah, right. And it's going out of fashion. I mean, nobody writes in the third person anymore.
Well,
And
the thing that's most going out of fashion, by the way, is the past tense.
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. I was just going to come to that. I
yeah.
don't know why there's a sudden fad for
No,
writing in the present
I think
tense.
it's,
He
yeah.
gets up, he walks out. I find it so annoying.
It's what they call immediacy, but that's immediacy is a virtue in social media. I don't think necessarily in literature. So, okay. So since we only have a few minutes left, I want to just read a page or two from the book. Now, this is a book that is partly set in Boston, partly set in Bangalore, and partly set in Madras. But since, although due to sins committed in a past life, I'm currently exiled to Delhi, I am from Bangalore, and obviously we're in Bangalore. So I thought I'd read about Bangalore. So Kannan, who is, as I said, the closest thing the book has to protagonist, goes to the US in the summer of 1996 to study at Northeastern. And because he grew up in this loveless home and frankly hates his parents, he doesn't visit for several years until his brother tries to arrange a marriage for him. And because he's sort of intimidated by his brother, he agrees. And this is about the Bangalore that Kannan finds at the start of 2001 when he comes back from 4.5 years in Boston. He arrived on a Thursday and was informed that on Saturday the girl and her father were coming up from Madras by the morning Shatabdi. Until then, he was free to roam the city in pursuit of privacy and of any internet connection that beat the 32K VSNL dial up his father used. At home, he found a periodical called Bangalore This Fortnight that devoted an entire section to the city's possibilities for pub hopping. Rather than contact his friends Vinay or Ashok, both of whom now worked in Bangalore, he set out alone, hopping between not pubs, but the cyber cafes that were growing across the city like German measles. Some were specially designed for gaming. Others offered cubicles enclosed on three sides and thus ideal for porn. None of them served coffee or made any other attempt to live up to the second half of their name. Most young men he saw typed so quickly and looked at their screens with such unwavering intensity that they must have been working on MS or job applications or cramming for exams. Any of the cafes was good enough for him. Harry Potter fandom demanded little bandwidth. But he rarely stayed in one longer than an hour, marveling each time at how little effort it took to find another. Even for a student of computer science, the internet had, in his time in Bangalore, been little more than a rumor. Santanam had told him to expect the city transformed. He had never thought of it as his city, less out of a reluctance to lay claim than out of the lack of the attachment such a claim implied. Now he saw that it had been his city, in the sense that it was gone. The new city was a blur of headlights and construction dust. The buildings that had carried over from one Bangalore to the next had acquired new facades in various shades of alucobond. The newly built offices of the IT services firms were more likely to be plate glass, but they must have come to regret the extra expense. Everywhere, he saw broken windows, the legacy of protests against the kidnapping of the actor Dr. Rajkumar, the chief deity of Sandalwood. The year before Kannan left for Northeastern, KFC had been forced to close its first Bangalore branch by a mob of picketing farmers. But KFC was back, and the lines outside it and outside Pizza Hut suggested that Kannadigas had made their peace with foreign junk food chains, or, more likely, had been outvoted by invading migrants. 4.5 years had been enough to remake Bangalore, and yet the new version felt provisional, as if it lacked whatever solidity the memory of the old city seemed to possess. He thought of his journey in reverse. The man who left Boston in the summer of 1996 would have returned at the start of 2001 to find every fire hydrant still in place.